Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that you might not expect from a philosophy perspective. We're going to be diving into the world of sign languages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so using excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on sign language semantics, we're going to explore just what this visual way of communicating can teach us about language and meaning in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because I think a lot of people, when they think of philosophy, they think of like, you know, dusty old books and, guys with beards striking their beards and things like that. And maybe not something as modern and dynamic as sign language.
Yeah, and what we're going to see today is that this can really kind of turn some of those assumptions about what language is and how meaning works on their head. So today our goal is to kind of uncover some of those surprising insights, and we're going to be looking at things like, logical visibility. So like how abstract logical structures that we believe give our sentences meaning can actually become really, really clear and overt in sign languages, where they're often hidden in spoken languages.
Right.
And we're also going to be looking at iconicity,
Yes.
which is where signs actually resemble what they represent.
Right.
And this is something that we see in spoken language to some degree, but in sign language, it's really central to the structure of the language.
Yeah, it's really pervasive and really interesting.
So let's get into it. One thing I think is important to address right at the top is that, for a long time, there was this misconception that sign languages weren't full-fledged languages,
Right. Yeah.
that they were somehow, less complex or less expressive. But, research has really definitively shown that that's just not the case.
Yeah.
There's been extensive work by people like Sandler and Lilo Martin back in 2006 and McSweeney and colleagues in 2008 showing that sign languages, they have complex grammars.
Oh, absolutely.
They have huge expressive possibilities, and they're even processed by the brain in very similar ways to spoken languages.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really hit that point home that they really are, full-fledged natural languages. They're just realized in a different modality.
Exactly, yeah.
So human language simply exists in two modalities,
Yeah.
signed and spoken.
Right, and what's so interesting about this is that, it allows us to kind of step outside of our kind of spoken language-centric view of the world.
Right.
And really see language from a different perspective.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into this idea of logical visibility.
Okay, yeah.
Because this is something that is really kind of mind-blowing to me. That, these abstract structures that, linguists and philosophers like to talk about can actually be made visible.
Yeah, it's really kind of a concrete manifestation of something that's often very difficult to grasp.
Exactly. And so one of the key ways that this happens is through the use of loci in sign languages.
Okay.
So can you explain to us what loci are and why they're so interesting from a philosophical perspective?
Sure. So loci are essentially designated locations in the signing space
Okay.
that a signer will use to represent objects or individuals that they're talking about. So it's almost like setting up, little mental placeholders in the space around you so that you can refer back to them easily.
Right. So like if you're signing a conversation about, say, Sarkozy and Obama,
Right.
you might establish a point like to your left for Sarkozy
Right.
and a point to your right for Obama. And then how does that play into something like pronouns?
Right. Well, so this is where it gets really interesting because if you think about English, if you have a sentence like Sarkozy told Obama that he would be reelected,
Right.
it's ambiguous who that he refers to.
Right.
It could be Sarkozy, it could be Obama, it could be someone else entirely.
Right.
But in many sign languages, including French Sign Language, which is often abbreviated as LSF, that ambiguity can be completely resolved by the use of loci.
Oh, wow.
So because you've already established, okay, this point is Sarkozy, this point is Obama,
Right.
then if you want to use a pronoun to refer back to Sarkozy, you just point to his locus,
Oh, wow.
and that point becomes the pronoun.
So the pointing is the pronoun.
Exactly. And so the direction of that point makes it completely clear who you're talking about.
So it's like the pronoun is actually physically manifest in the conversation.
Oh, right. It's not just this abstract thing that you have to infer from the context.
That's so cool. And so this is written in transcription as IX, right? So like
Right.
you'll see these glosses in the sign language linguistic literature.
Yeah. So IX is often used to represent this pointing sign or pronoun.
And this has led some linguists to think that, maybe these loci are actually visible manifestations of what we call logical variables, which are these kind of abstract placeholders that we use in logic.
Exactly. And so this is where it gets really philosophically interesting because it's like we're actually seeing these abstract entities that are usually hidden in the structure of language,
Right.
they're actually being made visible in sign.
Wow. And so there's this debate about, is pointing in sign really like a pronoun in speech,
Mm.
or is it more like a grammatical feature,
Right.
like gender in English?
Right.
Um, and I think this is a really interesting question because it gets to the heart of like, what is a grammatical category?
Right.
And what is the relationship between meaning and grammar?
Exactly. And so, some people argue that while loci are clearly very helpful for disambiguating reference,
Right.
their behavior in certain contexts suggests that they might actually be more like grammatical features.
Okay.
And so one of the things that people point to is that in some cases, loci can actually be disregarded.
Okay.
And this is something that's often associated with grammatical features in what are called bound variable readings. And there's a linguist named Kuhn who's done some really interesting work on this back in 2016.
Okay.
And he shows that, in certain cases, loci just don't seem to be doing the work that you would expect them to do if they were really representing individuals.
Right. So it's like they're there, but they're not really being paid attention to.
Exactly.
So it's almost like they've kind of been bleached of their semantic content. And
Right.
they're just kind of there as a grammatical marker.
Right. And so this has led to some kind of more nuanced proposals.
Okay.
So one proposal is that loci might actually be a visible realization of logical variables,
Okay.
but that this realization is mediated through a level of grammatical features.
Oh, okay.
And so this is a proposal that's been put forward by Philippe Schlenker,
Okay.
who's a very prominent linguistic philosopher.
Okay.
And he's got a paper on this from 2018.
Okay.
And he argues that, we need to think about loci as being both semantically contentful and grammatically relevant.
So it's almost like they're this hybrid category.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I think this debate about the nature of loci really highlights the complexity of these spatial anchors and forces us to really refine our understanding of how form and meaning interact in language.
Yeah, and so this idea of logical visibility extends beyond just like individuals.
Right.
It also applies to our understanding of time and even different possible worlds.
Yeah.
And this makes you wonder, is our mental toolkit for understanding these abstract domains more unified than we might think?
Right. And so this actually ties into a long-standing debate in philosophy of language about the nature of temporal and modal expressions.
Okay.
So, some philosophers think that temporal and modal expressions are fundamentally different from how we refer to individuals.
Okay.
But other philosophers, including some very influential figures like Barbara Partey and Matthew Stone,
Okay.
have argued for a more unified approach.
Okay.
And so the idea is that we might actually be employing a similar kind of logical framework across all of these domains. So Partey, back in 1973, observed that tense, which is like past, present, future,
Right.
actually has a lot of functional similarities to pronouns.
Okay.
So, for example, you can use a pronoun to refer to something that's contextually salient.
Right. Like if I say, she left me,
Exactly.
and it's clear from the context who she is.
Right. And Partey argued that tense can also have these kinds of context-dependent uses.
Okay.
So like if an elderly author is looking at an old photograph of herself
Right.
and says, I wasn't young,
Right.
it's clear that she's referring to the time depicted in the photograph.
Right.
And so Partey's idea was that if pronouns correspond to logical variables that represent individuals,
Right.
then maybe tense should also correspond to variables,
Yeah.
maybe time variables.
Right.
And then Matthew Stone in 1997 made a similar argument for mood,
Okay.
which is like possibility, necessity.
Okay.
So for example, if I say my neighbors would kill me while looking at a huge new sound system, I'm implying that that would be a consequence if you bought the sound system and played it really loud.
Right. Right.
And so Stone's idea was that if pronouns correspond to individual variables,
Right.
then maybe mood should correspond to world variables,
Sure.
which represent different possible worlds.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and so our source points out that sign languages seem to offer a really kind of neat and visually compelling argument for this unified view.
Okay. How so?
Well, because in many sign languages, including American Sign Language, often abbreviated ASL, and
Right.
Chinese Sign Language,
Okay.
you can use pointing to refer not just to individuals, but also to temporal situations and even to modal situations.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so for example, in example 9 in the source, we see that you can establish a locus to represent the situation. Sometimes I win.
Okay.
And then you can point back to that same locus in the next sentence to mean then I am happy.
Right.
But specifically in those winning situations. And then in example 10, we see something similar for modal situations.
Oh, okay.
So you can establish a locus to represent the possibility of you buying a new car,
Right.
and then you can point back to that locus to talk about what would happen if you bought the car.
Okay, so it's like the same mechanism is being used to refer to all these different kinds of things.
Exactly. So it's really suggestive of this underlying unity in how we handle reference
Right.
across all these seemingly different domains.
That's really cool. And it makes you think that maybe our logical toolkit for language is a lot more streamlined than we tend to think.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And it doesn't even stop there, right?
No.
We also have degree denoting loci.
Right.
And this is illustrated with the Italian Sign Language, which is often abbreviated LIS.
Right.
Example concerning Johnny's height.
Okay.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in LAS, the sign for tall can end at a specific vertical position in signing space.
Okay.
And that position can actually represent the degree of Gianni's height. Oh, wow. So it's physically mapping out.
Exactly.
Tall.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you can point to that location, that degree denoting locus,
Right.
and say something like that height is 1.7 meters.
So it's like the degree itself is being made visible.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And so this is really interesting from a philosophical perspective because it suggests that natural language might actually be committed to the existence of degrees,
Right.
which is something that philosophers have debated for a long time.
Right.
And it also suggests that we might actually have degree variables in our underlying logical system.
Oh, wow.
And so this is another really nice example of how sign language can give us these really interesting insights into the nature of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, this logical visibility stuff is just, it's really mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is.
But let's move on to another aspect of sign languages that I think is really fascinating, and that's iconicity.
Okay.
So I think most people have some intuitive understanding of what iconicity means in this context.
You know, like signs that kind of look like what they represent.
Right.
But it sounds like it goes way beyond just simple imitation.
It does.
So can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So while spoken language is largely based on arbitrary conventions, so
Yeah.
like there's no inherent reason why the sounds CAT should represent a cat.
Right.
Sign languages make really rich and systematic use of iconicity.
Right.
And so a sign is considered iconic if it bears a resemblance to its referent
Okay.
by preserving some of its structural properties.
Okay.
So it's almost like a photograph of a cat
Uh,
in that it captures some of the essential features of a cat,
okay.
but not all of them.
Right.
And so this can have really important implications for how we learn and process these languages,
Right.
and also for how we think about the relationship between symbols and their meanings.
Right. So it's not just about like individual signs looking like things, but it's also about like how the way signs are structured
Yeah.
and the way they're modulated can actually convey meaning.
Right.
So, for example, our source talks about iconic modulations.
Yes.
And so this is where you can take a conventional sign
Right.
and you can kind of tweak it or modify it in ways that reflect changes in meaning.
Right.
And so a great example of this is the sign for grow dubby in ASL.
Right.
So you can make the sign faster to
Hmm.
indicate faster growth,
Exactly.
or you can make it with wider endpoints to signify larger growth.
Right.
And so it's like you're layering meaning onto this base sign
Exactly.
through iconic variation.
And it's important to note that these iconic modulations aren't just kind of decorative flourishes.
Right.
They actually contribute directly to the meaning of the sentence.
Okay.
And so we say that they're at issue,
Okay.
meaning that they can be targeted by grammatical operators like if.
Okay.
So, for example, if I say if the talk is long and I make the long sign really stretched out, I'm conveying that the duration of the talk is the condition for me leaving.
Okay.
And similarly, if I say if the tree grows tall
Right.
and I make the grow sign really big,
Right.
I'm conveying that the height of the tree is the relevant factor.
Right.
And so this shows that iconicity is really integrated into the grammar of sign languages.
Right. And so it's not just this kind of separate system that's operating alongside the grammar.
Exactly. It's not just like an add-on.
Yeah, it's really part of the fabric of the language.
Right.
And so it seems like this iconicity also plays a big role in how sign languages convey what's called event structure.
Right.
So like the speed and manner in which an action unfolds.
Right.
And this is something that, we can do in spoken language to some degree.
Right.
Like we could say, he slowly walked across the room.
Right.
But it seems like in sign languages, it's a lot more direct
It is.
and kind of fine-grained.
Yeah, so the way that you move your hands in sign can actually convey a lot of information about how an event is unfolding.
Okay.
Um, so, for example, the source talks about the LSF sign for understand.
Okay.
And if you do this sign slowly and then suddenly, you can convey that the person had a hard time understanding something at first,
Right.
but then it suddenly clicked.
Okay.
And you can also modulate italic verbs,
Yeah,
which
got it.
are verbs that describe ongoing processes.
Right. So, for example, the LSF sign for reflect,
Right?
if you do this sign in a really concentrated way,
Yeah.
you can convey that the person is really thinking hard about something.
Okay.
And then there are these really interesting forms called incompletive forms.
Okay.
And this is where you only partially execute a sign
Okay.
to indicate that the event didn't quite reach completion.
Okay.
So, for example, the ASL sign for die,
Right.
if you only do part of the sign,
Right.
you can convey that the person almost died.
Oh, wow. So it's like the iconicity of the sign is actually being used to express this grammatical notion of aspect.
Exactly, yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and so this shows that iconicity can really have a profound impact on the meaning of a sentence.
Yeah, and so when it comes to like plurals and pluractionals,
Right.
we often think of repetition as being the way that this is expressed, but it's not just a matter of simple repetition.
Right.
Right.
Let's not.
So how does this work in sign language?
So across a lot of different unrelated sign languages, repetition is the common way to mark plurality
Right.
for both nouns and verbs.
Okay.
But the really interesting thing is how this repetition is modified
Okay.
can convey a lot of information about the quantity and arrangement of the objects or events that are being described.
Okay.
So you can vary the number of repetitions.
Right.
You can arrange them differently in space.
Okay.
And you can even do them with different kinds of movements.
Okay.
So you can do what's called a punctuated repetition.
Okay. Where you have these kind of sharp, distinct movements.
Right.
Or you can do what's called an unpunctuated repetition,
Okay.
where the movement is more fluid and continuous.
Well,
And these different kinds of modifications can convey all sorts of nuances.
okay, like what kind of nuances?
Well, for example, punctuated repetitions often imply a more definite number.
Okay.
So if I do 3 punctuated repetitions of the sign tree,
Right.
I'm probably talking about exactly 3 trees.
Okay.
Whereas if I do 3 unpunctuated repetitions,
Right.
I might be talking about at least 3 trees,
Oh.
or maybe even a larger indefinite number of trees.
Okay.
And then the spatial arrangement of the repetitions can actually create a visual representation of how the objects are arranged in the world.
Oh, wow. So it's like you're actually drawing a picture with your hands.
Exactly. And so this is another really nice example of how iconicity can be really deeply integrated into the grammar of sign languages.
Yeah, and it's not just the signs themselves that can be iconic.
Right.
But the loci themselves can also be iconic.
Yeah, exactly.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so we call these iconic loci, and this is where the location and signing space actually takes on some of the properties of the referent.
Okay.
So for example, if you point upwards to refer to a really tall person,
Right.
that's an iconic locus.
Okay.
Or if you establish a locus to represent a person, and then you put another locus inside of it to represent their heart,
Okay.
that's also an iconic locus.
Okay.
And so this can be really useful for representing part-whole relationships.
Right.
So for example, the source gives this example of my students.
Okay.
So you can establish a locus to represent all of your students, and then you can create sub-loci within that locus to represent individual students.
All right.
And then you can use pronouns to refer to the complement of a sublocus.
Okay.
So for example, if you point to the sublocus for John,
Right.
and then you use a pronoun that points to the rest of the locus,
Right.
you're referring to all of your students other than John. And so this kind of visual spatial organization is something that's really difficult to capture in English
Right.
because we don't have the same kind of spatial system for representing individuals.
Right.
And then you can also use iconic loci to represent degrees.
Okay.
So like we saw with the Gianni's height example,
Right.
the fact that the higher you place the locus, the greater the degree,
Right.
that's an iconic mapping.
Okay.
And you can also do this for time sometimes.
Yeah.
So like if you're talking about events that happened in the past, you might place them further away from you in signing space.
Right.
And so these iconic mappings really show how sign languages can weave together spatial representation and abstract meaning in really sophisticated and visually intuitive ways.
Yeah, and so I think this really challenges our assumptions
Mhm.
about, what kinds of things can be expressed in language.
Right.
We tend to think of language as being very abstract
Right.
and divorced from our physical experience of the world.
Right.
But sign languages really show us that that's not necessarily the case.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's move on to another topic that I think is really interesting, which is classifier predicates.
Okay.
Um, and so these seem to be this really cool area where convention and iconicity kind of intersect in this really productive way.
Right.
So can you tell us about classifier predicates?
Yeah, so classifier predicates are these conventionalized hand shapes that represent broad classes of entities.
Okay.
So for example, there are hand shapes for vehicles,
Right.
people, flat objects, and so on.
Okay.
And the thing that makes classifier predicates unique is that their position, orientation, and movement in signing space are all interpreted iconically.
Okay.
So for example, the ASL sign car CL vehicle drive-by
Right.
uses a specific hand shape to represent the vehicle,
Right.
and then the path that that hand shape traces in space actually depicts the movement of the car.
Oh, wow. So it's like a blend of this abstract category
Oh,
and this concrete visual representation.
exactly.
That's so cool.
Well, yeah, and so these classifier predicates have actually been compared to gestures in the spoken language.
Okay.
But there's a crucial difference.
Okay. What's that?
Classifier predicates are part of the lexicon of the sign language.
Okay.
They're not just spontaneous movements.
Right.
They're actually conventionalized forms that everyone in the community understands.
Okay. So they're like words?
Exactly.
Right.
And so early attempts to understand classifier predicates often try to analyze them as a kind of demonstration,
Okay.
meaning something like move like this,
Okay.
where this refers to the movement of the hand shape.
Right.
Um, but this demonstrative analysis has faced some challenges,
Okay.
particularly in accounting for the specific truth conditions that arise from the use of these constructions.
Okay.
So, for example, if I use a classifier predicate to describe a car driving by,
Right.
I'm not just saying that something moved in a particular way.
Right.
I'm actually saying that a car moved in that way. And so this has led to the development of what's called the pictorial analysis,
Okay.
which draws on ideas from the formal semantics of pictures
Yeah.
to try to understand how classifier predicates contribute to meaning.
Okay. So how does that work?
So the pictorial analysis is based on this idea that a picture is true of situations that can project onto it.
Okay.
So for example, a picture of a cat is true of all the situations in which there is a cat that is arranged in the same way as the cat in the picture.
Right.
And so the idea is that classifier predicates work in a similar way.
Okay.
So when you use a classifier predicate, you're essentially creating a little picture in signing space.
Right.
And that picture is true of the situations that can project onto it.
Okay.
So for example, if I use the classifier predicate plane,
Right.
Sankleola,
Right.
and I move it in a particular way,
Right.
I'm saying that there's a plane that is situated in that way and undergoing that motion.
Okay.
And so the key difference between a classifier predicate like plainsel
Right.
and the regular noun plane is that the classifier predicate forces an iconic interpretation of its spatial configuration and movement.
Oh.
So if I use two plane classifiers and I move them in parallel,
Right.
I'm directly conveying that there are two planes flying side by side.
Okay.
Whereas if I just use the noun plane twice,
Right.
I'm not necessarily conveying anything about their spatial relationship.
Right. Right.
And so this is another really nice example of how iconicity can be grammatically encoded in sign languages.
Yeah. And so there's even this notion of viewpoint dependence that comes into play with quantifiers.
Right.
So for example, if I say every plane landed,
Right.
using a classified predicate,
Right.
the way that I arrange the planes in signing space can actually be influenced by my viewpoint as the speaker.
Okay.
And so this suggests that our perspective as language users can actually shape the way that we represent events linguistically,
Right.
which is a really interesting idea.
Yeah, it is. And then another interesting thing about classifier predicates is that they often correlate with non-standard word order.
Okay.
And so this is thought to be because the order of elements in the sentence might actually reflect the visual salience of those elements in the depicted event.
Okay.
So for example, if the most visually prominent aspect of an action is the agent,
Right.
then the agent might be expressed first in the sentence.
Okay.
And so this suggests that there might be a link between iconicity and syntax,
Right.
where the way that we visually represent an event can actually influence the grammatical structure of the sentence.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, and so this raises this broader philosophical question of, how do sign languages compare to spoken languages,
Right.
especially when we consider that spoken language also incorporates gestures.
Right.
So are sign languages fundamentally different in how they represent the world?
Right. And so there's been this debate about, is sign language more iconic than spoken language? But it sounds like the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that.
It is.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Golden Meadow and Brentari, who are two very prominent researchers in the field of sign language and gesture,
Yeah.
they've argued that to make a fair comparison, we should actually be comparing speech with gestures
Right.
to sign with iconicity,
Okay.
because gestures are the primary way that spoken language incorporates iconic elements.
Right.
And so when we do this comparison, we see that there are actually some important differences.
Okay.
So one key difference is that many of the iconic constructions that we see in sign languages,
Right.
like those iconic modulations,
Hmm.
the repetitions, the classifier predicates,
Right.
they make what are called at-issue contributions to the meaning of the sentence.
Okay. So remind us what at issue means.
Right. So an at-issue contribution is part of the core assertion,
Right.
the main point that you're trying to convey.
Yeah.
Whereas a non-at-issue contribution is more like a side comment or presupposition.
Okay.
So for example, if I say John is tall and he's a doctor,
Right.
the fact that John is a doctor is an at-issue contribution.
Right.
Whereas the fact that I'm presupposing that you already know who John is,
Yeah.
that's a non-at-issue contribution.
Okay.
And so what Schlenker argued in 2018 is that many of the iconic constructions in sign languages are at issue,
Okay.
whereas gestures in spoken language are often non-at issue.
Okay.
So for example, if I'm talking about a car driving by
Right.
and I make a sweeping gesture with my hand,
Right.
that's a gesture that's conveying information about the path of the car.
Right.
But it's not really part of the core assertion of what I'm saying.
Okay.
It's more like a supplemental piece of information.
Okay.
Whereas if I use a classifier predicate in sign language to describe the car driving by,
Right.
that's an at-issue contribution.